Welcome to AKPsi's webinar titled What Constitutes an Official Fraternity Event? This webinar is part of the Chapter Operations Series. My name is Mackenzie Lauka, and I serve AKPsi as the Associate Director of Education. I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics regarding the audio and web-based features of today's program. In order to verify attendance, you should have linked to the GoToWebinar meeting room to the web link provided in your confirmation email. To access the handouts, as well as any supplemental documents available, you can click the plus sign next to handouts on your screen. Click the name of the handout to download the file. This webinar will be advanced remotely. At the end of the program, I'll explain how you can ask a question to our panelists. If you have any questions throughout the program, feel free to type it into the question box on your screen or tweet it using the hashtag AKPsiChat. Your questions will be asked at the end of the program. Also, be sure to check out our social media content. Portions of today's program will be tweeted with the hashtag AKPsiChat. You may also find some valuable resources on the AKPsi blog, Facebook page, Instagram feed, LinkedIn page, Twitter feed, or our YouTube channel. Risk management is an important aspect of hosting fraternal events, and the question often asked is what is considered an official AKPsi event? Join us today as we learn what an official event is, how to mitigate risk, and who is liable if anything should happen. In addition to covering these topics, we'll leave time for your questions and comments on the subject matter. For our program today, we have one presenter who's going to provide guidance and support while also provoking thoughts and awareness so you walk away from today's program with new insight on the topic. At this point, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Christian Nuccio. Christian graduated as a brother of the Eta Omega chapter at UNC Charlotte in 2010 with a degree in political science. As a volunteer, Christian has served as a section director, regional manager of risk management, and both regional chief of staff and chief operating officer until being appointed to the Judiciary Committee in 2015. He also serves as a member of the fraternity ritual team. Christian was selected as the Fraternity Regional Manager of the Year in 2013 and awarded the Silver Distinguished Service Award in 2014. Professionally, he served as a captain in the U.S. Army. Christian is currently pursuing a master's degree in leadership from Marshall University and expects to graduate in May. Now to get started with the presentation, I'll hand it off to Christian.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Hey, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. I want to let you guys know that my goal is to get this done with enough time to get some questions out and hopefully be done around 8:30 Pacific time, Eastern time. So that's what I'm shooting for. We'll see if we can get there. Throughout the presentation, please ask questions because Mackenzie will send them my way, and I'm happy to address them in the middle of the event as opposed to getting all the way to the end. But if we get them at the end, that's just fine too. So let's start with the introduction real quick. Why do we care about what an official and an unofficial event is? So I'll let you all know, for the past couple of years at the Judiciary Committee, we've been tracking trends that affect chapters because we really took a targeted approach to risk management. So when we talk about a targeted approach, I mean that when I give my briefings and my presentations every time, I don't want to say the exact same presentation. So what we're seeing is a lot of chapters get in trouble or we have to open investigations because they're just not clear on what an official and an unofficial event is. So hopefully this will kind of clear that up. So what I want to ask you all, and you can feel free to send this to Mackenzie, is I want to ask how your chapter defines official and unofficial events. So I want you to think about that for a second and go ahead and send it over to Mackenzie while I continue to talk. So maybe I'll see some of these and I'll be able to address them. But the other thing is I like to get this background so that when I go talk to chapters, I have an idea of what other chapters see things as. Because unfortunately, a lot of chapters I'm exposed to is through investigations, and I like to see what other chapters do. So let's talk about how the fraternity looks at both events and risk. So things are not risky or not risky for the fraternity. They work on a spectrum. So I know that I don't have a whiteboard in front of me that I normally use, but we're going to use a spectrum of, let's say, 0 to 10, okay? So when we're looking at an event, we're going to start at 0. So let's say, and the one I hear all the time is, what if me and my friends that I met through AKPsi, what if we just want to go ahead and hang out? Okay, that's a 0. It's just you and your buddies hanging out on that isn't an event spectrum, or is it risky spectrum? Now let's say you all want to go hang out after a chapter meeting. Well, maybe that moves up to like a 1 or 2. And let's say you coordinated that through your official chapter email or chapter spot. Now maybe it moves up a little more. And let's say that you are all part of the same pledge class. Now it moves up a little more. And each factor that goes into that brings it closer to the fraternity, that's how we move up the scale of whether or not this is a fraternity event. And the same thing works with risk. If you're doing something that maybe has one or two risk factors in it, maybe it's not that risky, but as you add in extra risk factors, the event gets more and more and more towards the risky side of the spectrum, and that's when we see chapters get in trouble. So another takeaway I want you to have is on that spectrum, it's not just moving up the chain. So there are also mitigation factors your chapter can put in and kind of move yourself back down that spectrum as well. So especially when it comes to chapter events, if you're going to have, if you're going to organize an event and it's not a chapter event and your chapter, knows that it's not a chapter event, don't use your official AKPsi email to coordinate that. Don't post it on your official AKPsi Facebook page to coordinate that. What you're doing there is you're mitigating the chances of that being called a chapter event. And we'll get into what exactly is going to constitute that later. But that spectrum is an important piece to remember, and something I'm going to address throughout this. All right, so the ultimate goal here is to be able to build a plan inside your chapter to address the most high-risk actions in your event. Okay, so let's talk about responsibility a little bit. Responsibility can be separated into two areas: chapter responsibility and personal responsibility. Usually on a whiteboard, I draw these as two separate boxes. I'm going to explain to you why these are so important to understand. These responsibility pieces, they can overlap sometimes, but generally what I find and what we find through investigations is that usually a problem starts at one of these areas, so maybe chapter responsibility, and then as the events evolve, it involves more and more personal responsibility. And I'm going to define these for you real quick. Chapter responsibility is the thing we worry about all the time. That's the, oh man, if we do this, we're going to lose our charter, or we're going to be put on suspension, or the JC is going to come down and investigate us. That's chapter responsibility. Personal responsibility is that piece where you say, hey, if you do this, you're going to get in trouble. So the chapter's not going to be, chapter's going to get away scot clean here, but maybe you'll get suspended, or we'll have to report you to the authorities. So those are those two separate boxes, and those will help us explain what a chapter offense is. So let's talk about chapter responsibility. So chapter responsibility occurs when the chapter is the proximate cause of the event. So that means when the chapter is the reason that the event is occurring. So, if you are a chapter president and you organize an event using chapter resources and chapter money, it's very easy for me to say that that's a chapter event. If you are just some guy who texts your friends and you go out and you get in trouble, it's much easier for me to say that is a personal event that falls under personal responsibility. So I want to talk a little bit about personal responsibility too. So that personal responsibility that occurs when the chapter is not involved at all. So, I'll go back to the chapter side. So if the chapter has made a decision to move forward with an event, if you voted on it, if it's in your chapter minutes, if you do it routinely, so if it happens, the first week of October and the first week of April every single year, this is kind of a chapter thing. If this is a one-time event or the chapter was completely unaware that it was occurring, that moves over more into that personal responsibility side. And what that does is, I'm assuming there are a lot of chapter leaders on this call, that removes your chapter from the responsibility piece, which is ultimately kind of what we care about the most. Not that we don't care about personal responsibility, but it's just much harder for us to do something about personal responsibility as opposed to chapter responsibility. All right, so with all that being said, let's figure out what an official event is. So I've kind of built this foundation so you understand how we look at things, the different types of responsibility. So I'm going to explain what an official event actually is. So the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway from this is there is no such thing as an unofficial event. So chapters cannot maintain an unofficial calendar. Chapters cannot just declare an event an unofficial event. So you can't organize this and say, hey, this event is unofficial, so just keep that in mind when we go out to this thing. we as chapter members or as brothers in our fraternity, we do not get to define what is and is not a chapter event. Everybody else does it. So the newspaper will define what a chapter event is for us. A police report will define what a chapter event is for us. Maybe a school report or the school newspaper will define what that is for us. Because what it comes down to is this test we call the reasonable person principle. The reasonable person principle is, would a normal person who has no knowledge of what is occurring be able to look at what occurs and say, yes, that was a chapter event? And usually that's what we see in police reports or the newspaper. So, this example I give all the time is if you, I'm going to use one simple event as our example. So let's say a brother gets drunk and gets behind the wheel and crashes his car and injures himself, okay? So now we've got an injured brother. The police report might say this individual left from a party where he was intoxicated, ran into a pole, and injured himself. And we would see that as kind of personal responsibility here. That guy did something stupid. Now, if that party occurred 1 minute after a chapter formal, and the chapter, which, against the rules, had purchased the alcohol there, and the name of the event was the AKPsi mixer, that police report's going to say a chapter brother who left a fraternity event and consumed alcohol at that event crashed his car and was injured. And that's what happens. Because of all those factors, they built up on that spectrum and fed into this was considered a chapter event. Same thing with the newspaper. I say this all the time in the meetings, which is if you get in trouble 1 minute after a formal, and it's the formal the AKPsi unofficial after party for your formal, the newspaper's not going to say this guy got injured at an unofficial AKPsi event. It's going to say he got injured at an AKPsi event. And then that's where that stamp comes down as official. So a common misconception we hear all the time is that there's some sort of fixed number or percentage that we look at for official events. The fraternity does not do that. So we do not have a 1, 5, 10, 15 person rule. We do not have a 20, 50% of the event composition or the chapter being present. None of those exist. We use the reasonable person test. So sometimes your chapter will have a rule that says, hey, anything over 8 people is considered a fraternity event. And if your chapter has that in your bylaws, or that's the rule you go off of, that's good. That shows proactivity and that your chapter is trying to do something to stop it. But just make sure you understand that just by applying that one rule, you might still be at a chapter event. So it's good to see the control, but make sure you do 2 things. One, you explain this is why we have this rule in place. If you can't explain it, reassess it in your chapter. Number 2, say, this is the rule we have, and this is the rule the fraternity has, and this is how we push those 2 things together to make sure we're in compliance. Something I'll cover real quick. For the first time in my 6 years of volunteering, I actually went to a school, and that school had, their school defined a chapter event as having a specific number of individuals. We comply with all school requirements, but we use the more rigorous of the 2 tests. So if the school says 30 people is considered a chapter event, our test is more rigorous, so that's the one we apply. If a school says 1 person is considered a chapter event, that's more rigorous, so we use the school standard test. So what I've done is I've explained the newspaper test, and with that, the reasonable person principle. That's the 2 pieces we use to determine what a chapter event is. I've told you about how the fraternity does not define official events. Public gets to define that. And I've talked to you a little bit about the fact that there's no such thing as a fixed number or percentage. So with all that being said, we're going to take that, we're going to put it into action. The question is, how do I know if my event is official? So the first thing, I can't recommend this strongly to you enough, is to examine the risk factors for your event and put them on the spectrum. So say to yourself, how are we communicating this event? Who is planning this event? And what's the composition of this event? And then after you've seen all those, say when and where are we doing it? If you're doing it in your normal chapter, location, or you're doing it in close proximity to an official chapter event, then you're going to move kind of up that spectrum. And what I recommend to every chapter is develop a form that somebody fills out that says, hey, we're doing this event, and this event has a lot of AKPsi people going to it. So we want to submit this form just to let you know we don't think it's a chapter event. We'd like the chapter to sign off on it. So what the chapter can do is they can run that through their compliance committee and determine, yes, this is a chapter event, or no, this is not a chapter event. And then you can have that documented in writing. So if something happens later on, you're able to show through documentation that you've done it. That brings me to my second point, which is document, document, document. Document everything. So this is kind of a weird culture shift for a lot of chapters, where chapters will say, I don't think I need to go and tell my chapter every time I want to throw a party at my house. And that's true. You don't have to tell your chapter every time you want to throw a party at your house. But if that party, there's a quote by Colin Powell that says, if something feels like it's wrong, it's probably wrong. I'm paraphrasing. But if that party, you're like, man, this sounds kind of like a chapter event, then for the sake of the chapter and for the sake of you, it's a good idea to go ahead and document and get that down. When you document it, you want to make sure, I always recommend email. So email this over to the risk person at your chapter so that you have a record and you won't lose it, right? And then include your chapter advisor and your chapter advisory board members, or include me. My email will be posted at the end of this in this conversation and say, hey, this is kind of what we're doing, and where do you see us going with this? If you can get your chapter advisor to either say, yes, this is an event, or no, it's not an event, then you've got a volunteer doing it, which is kind of that outside party. And that transfers a lot of responsibility off the chapter. So the other thing is to ask other chapters in the area, or ask your advisor for examples of events that have recently been considered chapter events or not chapter events. If you email me and you say, hey, this is kind of what we're looking at, I can usually provide an example of in the past when I've seen, hey, a chapter did this and they were fine, or hey, a chapter did this and we investigated them, and this is what they should have done differently so that they weren't investigated. I can give you either side of that. But the key to this is communication. And if you don't communicate it, I call them underground events. If you just throw these underground events over time, just by virtue of not communicating, if something comes up, your chapter already looks like they were doing something wrong because they weren't talking about it. And if you weren't doing anything wrong, you shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. I'm not saying that's the case all the time, but that's the original appearance. And we want to get away from that as much as possible, because most situations can be resolved with a couple of emails. It doesn't require a full field investigation. Unfortunately, if we don't have the communication, then we have to go down and open the investigation, which is not the preferred method of doing it. So the last thing, when in doubt, call your local friendly Judiciary Committee member. So if you go on the Judiciary Committee page, there's a list of JC members. It's akpsi.org/JC, and every single one has their information posted. You can email the Judiciary Committee directly, and we will answer. And then at the end of this, you'll have my phone number and my email address. You can text me or call me, anything you want. I'm more than happy to go on my way to look into this and kind of help you out through it. But don't not call me, or don't not call somebody like an advisor, because that's the surest way to kind of move into the, man, this is an official event and you had no idea around. So if you remember nothing else, remember this: volunteers are here to help. I'll never turn you away if you call me about a question, so just don't hesitate to ask.
All right, great, Christian. Thank you so much for all that information. And that's going to end up wrapping up his content portion of the program. So now it's time for all of you guys to send in your questions or comments, and we'll send them on to Christian to get them answered. As stated earlier, feel free to submit them via the questions box, or you can submit it on Twitter using the hashtag AKPsiChat. Questions and comments will be answered in the order they're received. Be sure to introduce yourself, including your chapter and college, so we can let Christian know where it's coming from. Right now, we're going to start with the first question, which is, what should I do if I'm at an event and I see something happening that shouldn't be? I don't want to be known as unfun or uncool just because I told someone they can't do something.
All right, so that's a great question. My recommendation to that, there are two components to what we look for when we do an investigation, right? There's what you did before to prevent the action from occurring, and then there's what you did after to prevent the action from occurring again. So in this situation, the event I use all the time is, let's say you have a pledge that comes out, and he's the 300-pound right tackle on your college football team, and he's underage and he's drinking at the event. What am I supposed to do? Well, my first question is, what did you do to stop it? So did your chapter have some sort of plan in place to prevent that from occurring? Did your chapter have a plan, hey, if this guy shows up and he drinks, what are we going to do to stop it? So that's going to be my first question. When it comes to the event itself, remember that there are two types of responsibility. And if this guy is breaking the law, he's taking on personal responsibility. Now, if he's breaking the law by drinking somebody else's alcohol that they provided him, we're opening up to more and more responsibility. So you kind of have to make a gut call there. Is this going to get out of control? Do I need to call the authorities? Do I need to end the event, which is something I always recommend. If things look like they're getting out of control, end the event. Just, hey, everybody's got to leave. I'm sorry. But when you do that, make sure that everybody who's been drinking still has some sort of safe way to get home. You're not ejecting them all from the house. So the last piece I always ask is, what did we do after to follow up? So did you do some sort of pledge action plan or brother action plan with this individual to let them know what they did was wrong and could risk the charter of the chapter? And did you put steps in place to let them know, hey, don't do this again, or if you are looking to do this, this is the way to do this properly? Hopefully that answers that question.
Good. And during your presentation, you talked about both personal responsibility and chapter responsibility. And I know a lot of us have heard the phrase that you're always wearing your letters. So how does this relate when I might be out with one of my friends that isn't a brother? What sort of responsibility do we have there?
So a lot of that's going to fall into personal responsibility. You know, I don't speak in definites, but let's say there's a picture of you that shows up on social media wearing letters, and you're doing some sort of illegal activity, and it's just you. You're not at an event. You're not doing anything wrong. The Heritage Center will most likely notify you that you need to take that picture down, but the chapter just doesn't maintain responsibility for that if they weren't involved in the issue at all. But if the chapter was involved in the issue, so if that's part of a larger event that was occurring, or if we're noticing in the background a giant Alpha Kappa Psi banner, that's when that chapter responsibility opens back up. So, you know, remember, every individual is responsible for their actions, but the chapter has an overarching responsibility for anything that might be construed as a chapter event. So, you know, to answer the question concisely, there's not much you can do about one person doing something wrong, but there is a lot you can do about the place and the time in which that person did that thing wrong. And so the chapter should be as far away from that wrongdoing as possible if they can prevent it.
Okay. And since we talked about also that the public is going to determine what is and isn't kind of an official event, how does this relate to chapters meeting their minimum requirements that they have to attend 2 fraternity events?
Okay, so really, when we talk about chapter events, the biggest problem I see when I do investigations are drugs and alcohol. And the problem with that, and what drives me crazy, is that, you know, Alpha Kappa Psi acknowledges that students of legal drinking age are going to drink in college. That's, you know, there's no question that they're not, and that's why we have procedures in place to make it, I don't want to say easy, but we make it so that students can drink during official events. That is a possibility. So we have these procedures in place, and to be frank, they're just so easy to follow. There's just small things you have to tweak sometimes, like you can't have a keg at the event. It has to be BYOB. And I'll see an event that complied 100% except they brought a keg. And I can't help but say, if you just didn't bring that keg, you would have been fine, but you all brought the keg. So, you know, review those alcohol policies and understand that all you have to do is comply with, you know, the minimum number of policies, and generally those events will be fine. And then those events can be added as part of your planning guides and added as an official event. The only time you can't add events as part of a planning guide is when your chapter's done some sort of infraction because, you know, you're afraid to because we've noticed. But if you've already written the planning guide before you've done the events and ran it through your advisor, then that event's going to count because the advisor's already stamped off on it.
So what about the events that, like, the fraternity puts on itself, like officer training and PBLI?
That's a great question. So when AKPsi puts on events like officer training and PBLI, if there's those are generally considered chapter events or fraternity events, and because of that, they follow all of the risk management guidelines underneath them. So, you know, the procedures are in place to do this, and a lot of times what we find is chapters don't know what is and isn't okay, so they just outright ban alcohol. And then they move back into this underground event thing that I talk about all the time. You know, when you do the underground event thing, you don't realize that if you had just brought, you know, non-alcoholic beverages and food to the event, for instance, it would have been in compliance. But because you didn't read the rules and you thought you just couldn't drink at all, you threw this event and it wasn't in compliance. And, you know, please email me if you're looking to do events that involve alcohol, so I can walk you through these steps and kind of help you through them, so you're not getting in trouble for things that you shouldn't even be getting in trouble for anyway. You just didn't know you had to.
We have a question coming in from Jennifer. She wants to know about those brother action plans that you mentioned. So how do you go about creating one addressing an action plan related to an alcohol-related issue?
Okay, so great question. I'll answer this pretty concisely for you. So brother action plans need to do a couple of things. They need to address what the individual did wrong and where it says that they can't do that. That's a huge piece. So you can't just say, hey, what you did was wrong. You need to say, written in this governing document, or written in our chapter bylaws, or written in this thing you signed at the beginning of the semester, you acknowledge that you weren't supposed to do this and you did it. And then in that brother action plan, you need to describe, here's what we want you to do in order to rectify the situation, and here's what's going to happen if you don't rectify the situation in a allotted period of time. And that period of time needs to be realistic. I'm going to Google something while I'm talking to you guys so I can get you a good example. I recommend to everybody, I'm not sure if you have a pen and paper in front of you, but there's a form online that we use in the Army called the DA 4856. DA 4856. If you Google that, it will come up. It's called the Developmental Counseling Form. And it is basically a brother action plan for my company. And it runs you through exactly what you need to do. You need to set forth what you did wrong and what we need to do to go ahead and fix this and when we're going to reassess this issue. So if that, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, two things. Either email me and I'll get you a copy of a brother action plan, or just resubmit a question in here to clarify, and I'm happy to expound on it.
All right, next to you, we've got some scenarios that some students have sent in. They want to know their concerns about. So one chapter is looking to host a benefit concert with a notable artist to be able to draw in the student body. The event is going to be open to all students on campus. What are kind of your concerns about this?
So that sounds like a great event. I would highly encourage you to do that event if you can. If it is being planned by AKPsi or has the AKPsi name on it, all it needs to do is just comply with the AKPsi policies. And like we talked about before, a lot of the AKPsi policies just require you to have a plan in place. So my assumption usually is that the question is about underage drinking. So maybe the chapter is asking, what are we going to do if people show up and underage drink? Well, if that occurs and the investigation comes down, we're going to ask, what did you do to prevent it? And what I want to see is a plan that was in place, that was feasible, and that you actually executed. And generally, I'm saying generally here, not all the time, generally the chapter should be fine as long as they had that in place. Sometimes they're not because the event was just or the plan was very poor, or they just completely failed to execute the plan. Or, the biggest piece here, they didn't run it by anybody and they just made it themselves. So if you can make a plan and the plan is feasible, you run it by somebody and you properly execute it, you should be in the clear for most of the things you're concerned about. But once again, you know, if this is a benefit concert you're looking to do, shoot me an email with what you're looking to do, and I'm happy to respond back to you.
Great. Another chapter usually hosts an event with alumni, and at the event is there a lot of food trucks, and some of those food trucks sell alcohol. She wants to know, is that okay to purchase alcohol at the event, and is it going to be considered an official event?
So, two separate issues here. On the official event side, yes, it's probably going to be considered a chapter event. There's just too many factors. You know, if it's for alumni and it's hosted by AKPsi and you guys planned it, I mean, this is like on 0 to 10, this is like a 9.9 that it's a chapter event. But nothing wrong with it being a chapter event. And in fact, you want it to be a chapter event so you can get the credits on the ACR. So your question then was, can we drink there? Well, the governing documents say that you cannot have alcohol at rush events or pledging events. So my question to you would be, are there rushies or are there pledges at the event? If the answer is yes, then you can't drink there. And the alumni should know that and should not be drinking there. If the answer is no, then as long as you're following the rest of those guidelines, you should be in the clear and they should be able to drink. Let me address one more thing for you real quick, which is, what do we do if an alumni drinks at our event? Well, just remember that if your alumni drinks at the event, they're taking on personal responsibility. Unless they're breaking a rule, like it's a pledging event and they're drinking there, then they're going to take on chapter responsibility because it's, the chapter could be held liable there for what they're doing. So, once again, let the person know you shouldn't be drinking here. If they say, I'm going to drink and there's nothing you can do about it, that's fine. Continue to drink if you're of age. And then, if you have to, shut down the event. But the key is to report it. Report it to a volunteer so that we can reach out to that person and say, hey, man, you might not realize that you're putting your chapter in jeopardy here. What can we do to prevent this from occurring next time?
One thing that you mentioned kind of earlier in your presentation is a compliance committee. Can you talk a little bit more about what those are and how they can help chapters minimize risk?
Yeah. So if you do not have a compliance committee in place, I am happy to help you get your compliance committee in place. But basically, my recommendation and what the fraternity recommends is that you have a sort of committee can review all the events you're doing, and all they do is look for risk factors. So they're just looking to see, does this comply with the rules that we have in place and the affidavits that people sign? And if it doesn't, that's okay. What can we do to change the event or to put some mitigation in? So maybe, a great example is an off-site retreat. If your chapter is doing an off-site retreat and you run it through your risk committee or compliance committee, they might say, hey, there's an increased chance that people will drink here because we don't have a lot of control over them over a three-day period, like a weekend. So what we'd recommend is, let's go ahead and have everybody sign a form acknowledging that this particular event is dry. So that's what the compliance committee would do, is say, kind of poke holes in your event and say, here are the problems, and here's what we recommend you do to fix it. And then you should have a chair of that committee that kind of, determines, can do the immediate responses to do the day-to-day. So let's say somebody sends an event in, the chair can say, you know what, this isn't a chapter event. There's no way it is, don't worry about it. Or the chair can say, this is a chapter event, and either I can tell you what to do, or it's so big that we need to refer it to the committee and have the committee do it. That's generally how I recommend the committee runs, but every committee runs differently. The key is, what we ask during investigations is, did you have a plan in place to prevent this from occurring at all? And if you can show me, yes, we did, here's the compliance committee, here are the minutes here, this is kind of what we did, that's helping your chapter out. And if the answer is like, no, we just kind of set it up and did it, and we do it every year, and we do it the same every year, well, you're not running it through a review. You're never checking to see if it's okay. And those are indicators to me that, maybe there are deeper problems here with the planning process.
Great answer, Christian. Looks like we currently have only one question left that's been submitted, so please encourage you guys, if you have any questions, submit them through the question panel. We can send it on to Christian. The question that we have here is, it's a lot of good information that we've sent out, but how do I talk to my chapter and get them on board with everything you said?
Okay, so I've done the easy part, which is talking to you guys. So the hard part, I agree, is getting it across your chapter. So a couple of resources I'll recommend. Number one is having either a JC member or a senior volunteer coming and presenting this data or this information to your chapter. I've already done kind of some video teleconferences with chapters. I'm happy to do it with your chapter. So I can tell them directly. Maybe that's number one. That's easy for me to do. Number two is, explain. I think the biggest piece here is explain the consequences to your chapter. So say like, look, for the most part, if you do something stupid, you're going to get in trouble for it. It doesn't bother us. But here are the things that you can do that will get us in trouble. And spell them out clearly, reference the governing documents. I'm not just making this up. This is where it says you can get in trouble for doing this. If you spell those out clearly, then that's kind of the framework for your chapter to get started. And then your chapter is going to have to go through your planning process and put a system in place that says, hey, if you meet these criteria, we require you to submit a form. If you do not submit a form and the event occurs, this is what's going to happen to you. So that plan piece and that consequence piece. So those are two ways to do it. Either have a good conversation with your chapter where, put some planning into it before you talk to them. So don't just say, I want to talk to you about what's an official event. Have a speech planned, have some talking points, have some sort of visual to guide yourself and talk about that. Or call in a volunteer. That's what we're here for. You know, our annual salary is $0. We do it because we really love interacting with chapters. And personally, I love helping chapters get through problems that I've seen other chapters fail at, because I've gotten that experience through that failure. So we are happy to reach out to you guys and do this. And if you can't find a volunteer, email me. I'll find somebody for you, or I'll do it myself.
Yeah. It looks like nobody else has submitted any questions, so do you have any final pieces of advice for them, Christian?
That's it. Thank you guys for being on the call. I think we are in 8 minutes over, so thanks for sticking around, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, I also want to thank all the participants joining in today. And as you can see on the screen is Christian's contact information. For any follow-up questions or conversation, feel free to contact him. Again, Christian, I want to thank you as well for your insight and for joining us tonight. We do finally have more upcoming programs listed on the AKPsi.org website. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please send them on